conquered mind, and the useful idiots, the greatest obstacles to the total Oromo liberation struggle. Since the ancient and the largest Oromo nation of the Northeast Africa with a rich history, a vibrant democratic system known as Gada, and a profound cultural identity in Africa have stood at the front lines of resistance against half-devil and half-Abyssinian outlaw warlords for generations. The Abyssinian, a foreign translation of the word 𝗏𝗶𝗱s, are the offspring of divers, invaders, settlers classified as Semites out of Africa who branded themselves as Amhara and Tigray. The aliens from Southwest Asia, Todes Yemen, who settled within the Northeast African indigenous Cushitic people. At the heart of the Oromo socio-political identity lies the Gada system, an ancient, democratic, and egalitarian governance structure that serves as a beacon of Oromo resilience in the landscape of African liberation struggles. The quest for self-determination from one of the most backward, dependent, predatory, and obligatory settler colonial Abyssinian empire. The Gada system survived centuries of ethnocidal war waged by the predatory settler Abyssinian warlords armed with modern European-made, and provided firearms, refiles, mentorship, finances, and political backing at global stage. Whatever acts of subjugation, policies of eliminations, vilification, incarcerations have been depolied, the Gada system survived in the minds of the heroes and heroines we thank who sacrificed their life and inherited from generation to generation and now found in its renaissance. The long and arduous journey of the great Oromo nation toward national self-determination. The quest for justice and liberation has spanned generations. The struggle is frequently stalled, not by a lack of resolve, but by the proliferation of the conquered mind and the strategic deployment of useful idiots. The internal mechanisms of psychological subjugation. These have been often the most formidable barriers than the external forces of oppression. To understand why the Oromo struggle for liberation yet remains unfinished, we must confront these internal adversaries with intellectual honesty and unflinching courage. What is the conquered mind? The concept of the conquered mind, popularized by thinkers like 𝗠𝗏𝗄𝗏 and Frantz Fanon, the intellectual intersection of 𝗠𝗏𝗄𝗏 and Frantz Fanon, offers a profound critique of the conquered mind. The psychological subjugation that persists even long after the formal mechanisms of colonial rule have been dismantled, let alone the Oromo people, and the downtrodden masses of the population that counts 130 million plus, incarcerated in one of the most backward, dependent, predatory settler colonial Abyssinia empire for 1.5 century to the present. Fanon stated colonialism is not merely a political or economic imposition, but a psychic trauma that alienates the colonized subject from their own consciousness, forcing them to adopt the worldview and cultural validations of the oppressor. 𝗠𝗏𝗄𝗏 extends this analysis into the realm of linguistics and literature, particularly in his seminal work Decolonizing the Mind. He argues that language is the primary carrier of culture, and that by imposing settler colonial languages as the sole medium of intellectual and creative expression, the colonial power effectively delinks the colonized from their history, cosmology, and self-worth. For both thinkers, the conquered mind is a state of internalized inferiority. They argue that true liberation requires more than state sovereignty. It necessitates a foundational, mental decolonization, a deliberate reclamation of indigenous languages, myths, and histories to dismantle the hegemony of the colonizer's perspective and restore the dignity of the autonomous subject. When a people are subjected to long-term systemic oppression, the oppressor often seeks to dismantle the culture, language, and history of the colonized. Over time, the oppressed may begin to view their own traditions, in this case, the rich heritage of the Gada system, as backward or inferior, while adopting the values and political frameworks of the hegemony. 1. The conquered mind, the internalized oppressor. The conquered mind is the most insidious weapon in the arsenal of an imperial system. It is a psychological state where the oppressed individual ceases to view the world through their own cultural lens, instead adopting the values, logic, and priorities of their oppressor. When a mind is conquered, the victim begins to justify their own marginalization. In the context of the Oromo Nation, this manifests in several ways. The devaluation of identity. Individuals may view their language, Afan Oromo, history and traditions, Gada, as inferior, unconsciously believing that progress only comes through assimilation into the dominant culture. Cultural estrangement. A prioritization of foreign languages and customs over Afan Oromo and Oromo traditions. Political fragmentation. The adoption of divisive political ideologies that work against Oromo unity, often fueled by divide and rule tactics. Self-doubt. A reluctance to embrace the Gada system as a modern, viable democratic alternative, preferring state-centric models that have historically failed the people. The Gada system versus the conquered mind. The Gada system is not merely an ancient tradition. It is a sophisticated political philosophy based on accountability, human rights, and peaceful transition of power. The conquered mind acts as a filter that prevents the full realization of these principles. When individuals internalize the propaganda that the Oromo are stateless or ungovernable, without the imposition of external authoritarian structures, they inadvertently validate the very systems that suppress their autonomy. To liberate the Oromo struggle, the Gada system must be decolonized. It must be viewed not as a historical relic, but as a living, breathing framework capable of solving contemporary challenges. How to overcome strategies for intellectual liberation. If the conquered mind is the worst enemy of the struggle, then intellectual decolonization is its greatest weapon. Here is how the movement can reclaim its narrative. 1. Reclaiming linguistic sovereignty. Language is the vessel of culture. By prioritizing Afan Oromo in education, governance, and daily discourse, the Oromo people reclaim the intellectual space necessary to define their own reality. 2. Investing in Gada literacy. It is not enough to talk about Gada. One must understand its institutional mechanics. Promoting research and academic discourse on how Gada principles can be modernized to resolve clan and regional disputes is essential for building internal unity. 3. Fostering a unified narrative. The conquered mind thrives on fragmentation. By focusing on shared goals and universal Oromo values, Safu moral and ethical conduct, and Takama unity, the movement can insulate itself against external attempts to create internal divisions. 4. Critical engagement with history. Liberation requires an honest assessment of history. This means educating the youth about the realities of past conquests while celebrating the resilience of Oromo resistance. It involves shifting the focus from being subjects of a state to being citizens of a culture that governs itself. The path to true liberation. The liberation of the Oromo people will not be achieved through political maneuvering alone. While constitutional reform and international advocacy are vital, they will remain hollow if the people remain psychologically tied to the narratives of their oppressors. The struggle must begin with the individual. By decolonizing the mind, reclaiming the values of the Gada system, and fostering a sense of pride in Oromo identity, the people can dismantle the internal walls that have held them back for too long. True liberation is not just about the freedom of the land. It is about the freedom of the mind. When the Oromo people fully embrace their own heritage as a legitimate, superior framework for their future, the barriers to their political liberation will inevitably crumble. The fear of sovereignty. Years of systemic miseducation lead some to fear the very liberation they claim to seek. They are conditioned to believe that the Oromo cannot exist as a self-determining entity, adopting the stability argument used by centralized regimes to justify ongoing domination. Fatalism. The conquered mind adopts a narrative of helplessness, viewing the status quo as an unchangeable reality rather than a fragile construct held together by colonial force. Overcoming the conquered mind requires a radical process of decolonization. It demands an intellectual return to Oromo values and a critical analysis of historical narratives that have served to diminish the Oromo contribution to history. 2. The useful idiots, pawns in the game of divide and rule. The term useful idiot refers to a person who is manipulated by a political movement or regime to serve its interests, often without the individual fully realizing they are being used. In the Oromo struggle, the proliferation of useful idiots has become a primary tool to fracture national unity. These are individuals who, whether through opportunism, ego, or genuine political naivety, become agents of the status quo while masquerading as activists or intellectuals. How they hinder the struggle. The politics of fragmentation. They are often used to create false binaries, pitting regions, clans, or religious groups against each other to prevent a unified front. Distraction and deflection. When the liberation movement makes significant strides, the useful idiot is deployed to shift the discourse toward irrelevant controversies, thereby draining the movement of its focus and momentum. Legitimizing the illegitimate. By participating in sham processes or providing intellectual cover for oppressive policies, they lend credibility to regimes that would otherwise be rejected by the masses. The danger of the useful idiot lies in their proximity to the cause. They don't attack the movement from the outside. They erode it from within, spreading cynicism and distrust among the youth and the diaspora. 3. The path forward, intellectual autonomy and strategic unity. If the Oromo nation is to overcome these internal obstacles, the movement must prioritize ideological clarity and strategic discipline. Prioritize intellectual re-education. The struggle must move beyond slogans. It requires a movement that invests in developing thinkers and leaders who possess unconquered minds, individuals rooted in Oromo philosophy who can navigate complex geopolitical landscapes without losing their core moral compass. Foster collective accountability. The Oromo liberation movement must become adept at identifying and isolating the narratives pushed by those who serve, knowingly or unknowingly, the interests of the oppressor. This is not about silencing dissent. It is about raising the threshold of political maturity. We must distinguish between legitimate internal debate and the calculated fragmentation brought on by external manipulation. Reclaim the narrative. The history of the Oromo has been told by others for too long. By controlling the narrative, documenting our own history, celebrating our own heroes, and analyzing our own failures, we insulate the next generation from the psychological traps of the conquered mind. The liberation of the Oromo nation is not merely a matter of changing a government. It is a matter of changing the reality of the Oromo existence. While external forces will always seek to suppress the Oromo people, the most dangerous enemies are the ones that reside within. The hesitation, the doubt, the internalized inferiority, and the puppets who aid the oppressor's hand. To overcome, we must first liberate the mind. Once the mind is free, the chains of physical, economic, and political bondage will inevitably follow. The struggle continues, not just on the battlefield or in the halls of power, but in the hearts and minds of every Oromo. Victory to the great Oromo nation.